Hi everybody! This video goes over the instructions for your first paper for English 330, which is a response paper on a short story of your choice. This assignment has two components, two parts. The first part is a passage from one of the assigned stories that is typed out in a separate document, and the second part is the actual paper itself. And this paper should be 2 to 3 full pages, and it should analyze the passage that you've chosen. And when I say it should be 2 to 3 full pages, I mean that it should be at least 2 full pages, not 1.5 pages. A paper that is less than 2 full pages will be penalized. And you may write about the same passage that you discussed in a journal or a discussion post, or you may choose a different passage to write about. And if you do choose a passage that you've already written about, you are definitely welcome to draw on things that you've already said in either a journal or a discussion. So I want you to feel free to continue to develop ideas that you've already begun developing elsewhere. I'm going to begin by talking about picking the passage, and then I will move on to talking about writing the paper itself. As I just said, this paper asks you to analyze how to choose a passage of basically roughly 200 to 300 words, and then analyze how the author uses word choice, imagery, and other elements to develop a setting, a character, or a theme. So this means you should choose a passage that focuses on the setting, on a character, or on the theme of a story. And some examples might be a passage that describes the setting in detail, a passage in which the narrator or another character describes a character. So this would be a passage where there's a lot of direct characterization happening. Or in a first-person narrative, you might also choose a passage in which the narrator unconsciously reveals an aspect of their personality, motivations, or attitude towards others. And this would be a passage where there's a lot of indirect characterization happening. After you've chosen the passage, you need to analyze it. And the first step is to type it out in a separate document, and then you are going to submit that document along with your paper. If you want, you can copy and paste the passage into a separate document, but you'll probably get more out of the passage if you type it out. I know that when I'm typing something out, I noticed a lot of things about the language and the words and the imagery and other aspects of the passage that I didn't notice when I was reading it. So after you have that in a separate document, I encourage you to read it several times, pay attention to words, images, and other elements, and I encourage you to actually print it out and mark it up. So circle important words, write notes in the margins, underline things that seem important. Doing this activity, which is called annotating, can be a really useful starting point for identifying what is important and what you want to talk about in your paper. And I give you in the prompt some questions that you might find useful as starting points for analyzing your passage. You don't have to consider all these questions. Choose and use the questions that are useful for the passage that you've chosen and the aspects of the story that you want to talk about. So if you want to talk about setting, you could consider how the narrator uses word choice and imagery to develop the setting of the story, and especially think about what kind of atmosphere is being evoked through the word choice and imagery. So is the atmosphere spooky? Is the atmosphere calm and peaceful? Is the atmosphere exciting and vibrant? And those are all different atmospheres that can be evoked through different words and different images. If you're talking about the theme of the story, you should think about how the word choice, the imagery, and other elements develop or reinforce the central idea of the story. So for example, if you're looking at how in the story, when Mr. Prasada came to dine, how the narrator, if you're looking at the narrator sort of evolution from sort of innocence to being sort of more worldly and sort of growing up within the story, you could pick up, and you've picked a passage that illustrates that. You might, look at how the words and the images and even other elements help illustrate that sort of shift in the character, sort of moving from a more sort of innocent worldview to a more sort of higher sort of awareness of how the world is complicated and how she sort of grows up through that. And then if you are thinking about characterization and your story has a first-person narrator, you might think about what the narrator's word choice reveals about his or her personality and motivations. So, for example, if you're writing about Cathedral, which has a first-person narrator, what does the narrator's word choice reveal about his personality and his motivations? If the story has a first-person narrator, you could also think about how or what the narrator's word choice reveals about his or her attitude towards other characters in the story. So again, with the example of Cathedral, you can think about what the narrator's word choice and images reveal about his attitude towards, say, his wife, or his attitude towards Robert, the blind person in the story. If the story has a third-person narrator, you could think about how the narrator uses word choice and imagery to provide information about the character's personality and motivations. So in the example of A Good Man is Hard to Find, you might think about how the narrator uses word choice and imagery to provide information about the grandmother, about the things that she cares about how she sees herself, about how she feels about other people. And then if the story has a third-person narrator, you can also think about how the narrator's word choice and imagery shapes the reader's attitude towards the character. So does the narrator present the character in a sympathetic light or an unsympathetic light? And then how so? So to go back to the example of A Good Man is Hard to Find, does the narrator present the grandma in a sympathetic light or an unsympathetic light? And then once you've identified that, you can go sort of even further. So I think most of us would agree that the grandmother is presented in an unsympathetic light. So what exactly what sort of feelings does the narrator try to evoke in the reader towards the grandma? Do we see her, how does the reader encourage us to see her as selfish? How does the narrator encourage us to see her as, maybe hypocritical? So thinking about how the words and the images shape our feeling towards the grandmother as readers. All right, just wanted to make sure I was on the right slide. So once you've analyzed the passage, you will hopefully have a fairly strong sense of what it is that you want to say about this passage. So what in general does this passage reveal about the setting? What does it reveal about the character? What does it reveal about the theme? And once you have a general sense of what it is you want to say, you're ready to write your paper. Unlike formal essays, this paper does not need to have a fully developed introduction or conclusion. It should have a thesis, and you can just put that thesis at the top of the paper, that's fine. And you should present textual evidence, quotes, and examples for the story that support the thesis. So the two things I'm interested in are a thesis that makes a interpretive claim, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, and then also paragraphs that develop and support that claim, which I'll also talk about in a few minutes. So as far as your thesis goes, it should make a specific interpretive claim about how the author uses word choice, imagery, and other elements to develop the story setting, characters, or theme. And I give you a couple examples here, one example of a weak thesis and one example of a strong thesis. So the weak thesis I give you is, in summer, David Updike uses word choice and imagery to develop the setting. So this thesis tells me what you're going to talk about, word choice, imagery, and setting, but it doesn't make a claim. It doesn't tell me what you're going to say about these things. It doesn't give me any sense about what you think these elements add up to and what kind of meaning these elements convey. The second thesis that I give here is stronger. So this thesis is, in summer, David Updike's word choice and imagery highlight the change in seasons, the shift from the restless heat of summer to the peaceful coolness of fall. So this thesis tells me that you're going to be talking about word choice and imagery, but it connects those elements to a claim about meaning. So it connects those to a claim about the change in seasons, specifically the restless heat of summer to the peaceful coolness of fall. So this is a more specific thesis, it's more detailed, and it also makes an interpretive claim about what is happening with the setting in the passage that the writer has chosen. So this thesis is stronger than the first one. And then the body of the paper, so the rest of the paper should develop and support the thesis. You should have multiple paragraphs, and each paragraph should have a clear claim that is presented in a topic sentence, and the rest of the paragraph should develop or support that claim. And a general rule is that every time you make a point or claim, you should present a quotation or an example that supports that claim, and an explanation of how the quotation or example supports the topic sentence. And teachers, like myself, sometimes call this a quotation sandwich because you sandwich the quotation between the claim and the explanation of the quotation. And on this next slide, I give you an example of that. So what I have on this slide is the first part of a paragraph from the sample paper that's on Blackboard. And this paper is about a passage from A Good Man Is Hard to Find. It's discussing a passage in which the family has just had the accident and is watching the car approach them, and that car has the misfit and his cronies in it. And I'll go ahead and I'll read the first part of this paragraph first, and then I'll talk a little bit about how the writer has constructed this paragraph. So, as I said, this paragraph is about a passage from A Good Man Is Hard to Find. So the passage, or the paragraph, reads, "The foreboding atmosphere of the passage is further developed in the next paragraph, which introduces the occupants of the hearse-like automobile. Instead of smiling and speaking to the stranded family, the driver stays silent and stares at them with a, quote, steady, expressionless gaze," end quote. The word expressionless is especially unnerving. It suggests the driver is either hiding his emotions or not capable of typical human emotions. So the first sentence of this passage is the topic sentence, which presents the primary claim of the paragraph. And that sentence is, "The foreboding atmosphere of the passage is further developed in the next paragraph, which introduces the occupants of the hearse-like automobile." So this sentence is telling us that this entire paragraph is going to be about the atmosphere of the passage, which is sort of foreboding, and that it's going to be also talking about the people who are in the automobile. And then the second sentence of the passage provides an example and a quotation that supports that claim. So this sentence is, "Instead of smiling and speaking to the stranded family, the driver stays silent and stares at them with a, quote, steady, expressionless gaze," end quote. So it's introducing this quotation and is talking about the weird behavior of the driver, who we later learn is the misfit. And then the final sentence from this excerpt explains that quotation, explains that example, and connects it back to the topic sentence. So this sentence says, "The word expressionless is especially unnerving. It suggests the driver is either hiding his emotions or not capable of typical human emotions." So in this sentence, the writer is picking apart the word expressionless and explaining why it's so weird that the driver is behaving this way, and then connecting that back to the initial claim. So the initial claim was that this passage has a sort of foreboding atmosphere. So in this final sentence, the writer is explaining how the driver's weird behavior is adding to that foreboding atmosphere. So we have claim, example, and quotation, and then explanation of the example and quotation. And for a more in-depth example of how this works in the paper as a whole, you can take a look at the sample paper that I have put on Blackboard in the handouts area, and that gives you sort of a whole paper that sort of provides an illustration of how this works at a larger scale. And then finally, I will talk a little bit about the paper requirements. So the paper should be formatted according to MLA style. So this means it should be typed in 12-point Times New Roman font. It should be double-spaced. It should have 1-inch margins. It should have a heading with the page number and your last name in the top right corner of each page. And it should have a heading in the top left corner of the first page that has your name, the instructor's name, the class, and the date. And quotations should be properly formatted and documented using parenthetical citations. And there's a handout on Blackboard in the handouts area that explains how to do this and shows examples of how to do this for both short quotations and long quotations. And then finally, the paper should have an MLA style works cited page. And there's also a handout on Blackboard in the handouts area that shows how to put together a works cited page for short stories like the ones that you'll be writing on for this assignment. And if you need the information about the book that the short story came from, each story that you find on Blackboard will have either at the beginning or at the end, it will have information about the anthology that the short story came from, the editors of the anthology, the publisher, and then also the page numbers that in the anthology that the story comes from. So everything that you need to put together a works cited page should be available in those PDFs of the stories. And then once you have everything and you're ready to submit it, you should submit both the passage, that typed out passage, and the paper to, there's a Dropbox that will be in the week 5 folder of Blackboard, so you can submit the two of them together. And both parts, so both the passage and the paper, are due 11:59 p.m. on Sunday, September 22nd. And if you have any questions about the paper or any part of the paper, feel free to either send me an email or post a question to the Ask My Instructor forum on Blackboard. I am also happy to set up video conferences with you if you want to talk about your paper in detail. Just let me know ahead of time and we can schedule a time to talk. And we can talk if you just have sort of questions and you want to make sure you understand the expectations for the paper, or if you have a draft of your paper and you get that done early and you want to talk about that before you turn it in, we can also schedule a time to do that too. So just let me know if you would like to schedule a time to do that. And otherwise, I will look forward to reading your guys' paper when I get them on Sunday.